for being here on relatively short notice. We just 6 days out from the election, and we thought this was a timely bill, and I just want to express gratitude to our two senators and Assemblywoman for their outstanding work to address the anxiety that has been expressed almost universally about what's going on with this, well, what's going on to address the issue of the anxiety, the growing anxiety about fair and free elections, the anxiety around intimidation, the anxiety around protecting the sanctity of the voting process. And in many ways, this is one of a number of bills, but in many ways this begins to answer that question in a substantive way, the bill that I'm about to sign. But rather than belaboring the point, I'll finish up. I wanted to hear from our authors, and Assemblywoman, perhaps we'll listen to you first and walk us through it with all your background, by the way, full disclosure.
7 years as a chief elections official.
Yeah, so you know a thing or two about the bill that you've gotten on my desk.
Yes. Well, I just want to thank you for agreeing to sign it today. I'm going to hold you to that. The bill does three important things. First, it strengthens protections for the chain of custody of voted ballots by increasing the accountability for the unlawful seizure or removal of ballots from elections officials. When the sheriff in Riverside seized the 650,000 ballots from the elections official, I was horrified. Breaking that chain of custody breaks the trust that voters have in our elections. Second, the bill prohibits unauthorized access to voting systems, voting machines, or voter data without lawful judicial authorization. And third, it gives the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and local elections officials stronger legal tools to respond quickly when election interference threatens voter confidence or election administration. So let me be clear. Election workers should never fear political intimidation for simply doing their job. Voters should never wonder whether ballots were improperly handled, and law enforcement powers should never be misused in ways that jeopardize the integrity of our democratic process. So SB 73 helps to ensure that California elections remain secure, transparent, and administered according to the rule of law. Our democracy depends not only on the right to vote, but on the public's confidence that every lawful vote will be protected and counted fairly. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
I appreciate it. Senator, you want to
Sure.
add
Well,
to
thank
that
you,
as
Governor, and thank you, Assemblymember Pellerin and Senator Cervantes, for your leadership in this space. Let me take you back to Election Day, November of 1988. You youngsters don't roll your eyes yet. On Election Day 1988, I was a federal prosecutor. I was assigned as the duty officer for any election irregularities. Early that morning, I got a call that there were police officers stopping Latinos from voting in Orange County. You hear weird things all the time in that job. A couple hours later, I got another phone call, then a third phone call, so I grabbed another prosecutor. We went out, and there was a person, a policewoman, with a big sign that said, "Non-citizens may not vote." We watched as a Latino couple, or what appeared to be a Latino couple, approached her, engaged in conversation, turned and walked away. Now, we had heard that they were asking for proof of citizenship. They turned, walked away. We got out of the car, and of course we were prosecutors, white shirt, red tie, blue suit. She dropped her sign. We pursued for 30 seconds, lost her. That time, that wasn't illegal. I didn't know it wasn't illegal to do that at the time. But the person who was responsible actually won that election. There were no Democrats elected at any level in Orange County. I ran against that guy, Kurt Pringle, and won. But that was the catalyst that got me into public life, at least elective public life. And so I thought, 36 years ago, that issue was probably done. And here we are today. Here we are today where the President of the United States and others are saying, hey, we're going to do the exact same things. We're going to engage in what is essentially intimidation of voters. And so thank you to the leaders here in California for not standing for that, for being proactive to make sure that we do everything we possibly can to protect the integrity of this election, as it has been protected for decades and decades until somebody started to threaten it. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Cervantes. Thank you again for your leadership.
Yes, well, right now California is standing with courage, standing with urgency to protect voters' rights to cast a ballot free from intimidation or interference. We've seen an incident in my own home county of Riverside where ballots were seized and the chain of custody was broken. That is against the law. SB 73 puts in protections to ensure that ballots will be secured and that voters have confidence in our election system that their voices will be heard at the ballot box. I am grateful that we are standing in this moment today to protect the integrity of our elections. I'm grateful to the governor, to the pro tem, to the speaker, and to my legislative colleagues for meeting this moment with urgency and meeting this moment with resolve.
I appreciate it, Senator. Thank you, all of you, for your leadership in this space. As I noted, this is not the final word on election integrity. Quite the contrary. We signaled in the May revise our ongoing negotiations and conversations around providing more resources, not just for the June ballot, but obviously for the November ballot. And those conversations continue to be extraordinarily productive. As I hinted a moment ago, and Senator Cervantes in particular, among others, have other election bills that are teed up, that are being negotiated, amended in real time. We've been monitoring and watching those as well. This one is a first good bill to sign on the basis of two things. One, it goes in effect immediately upon my signature, number one. So in many ways, it addresses some of the anxieties around next Tuesday's election. Does it address all the issues in the past? No, and that's an inevitable question, and obviously that was part of the debate. I don't want to overstate it. Would this, quote unquote, have stopped what happened with an individual in Riverside County? Not necessarily, though there are aspects and component parts that certainly would make it more difficult and wouldn't require necessarily the clarification of the state Supreme Court that ultimately ended the abuse in Riverside County with those 650,000 ballots. And that is certainly that clarity is going to get benefited because of the legislation. This is about sending information out with clarity, drawing a line in terms of what you can and cannot do as it relates to the registrars coming out of the DOJ, the AG's office, which is important. That clarification is important. It addresses the issue of peace officers and any prospect of intimidation, addresses the issues, as was suggested, around chain of custody. And so I think it's an important group of specific provisions and part of what will be a mosaic of grouped legislation to address the legitimate anxiety that is out there. And I say legitimate, and forgive me, would be remiss if I didn't just briefly remind you of the legitimate reasons that we need to do this. I'll remind you that Prop 50, which was the election in question in terms of the Riverside County ballots, that was kicked off at the Democracy Center, of all places, in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. And as we entered the building, there were masked men in front of the rally to kick off the campaign that ultimately became Proposition 50, the redistricting campaign. Those masked men were led by someone by the name of Greg Bovino. We said at the time, by the way, none of them were necessarily identified. And there was no ID. There was, as I suggest, masked men, with the exception of Bovino, who was certainly looking forward to engaging all of you in preening. We said at the time was a preview of things to come. He became a household name. Ultimately was fired by the Trump administration, retired after his antics that led to the deaths of 2 people in Minnesota, and of course antics that were extended all across the United States. Of course, that happened after the federalization of the National Guard. 4,000 National Guard were federalized, 700 active duty Marines were sent not overseas, but to the second largest city in the United States of America. We said at the time that was a preview of things to come as well. Of course, we saw that played out in the streets of D.C., Illinois, and elsewhere. And we make this point to make the point that needs to be made. This is all happening in open sight. What happens is it's a stacking. It's not the one act. It's the sum total of all of these things happening. There's a pattern. And that's what this legislation begins to address, a pattern of actions. That pattern, by the way, unfolded in primarily blue states where the Trump administration tried to access the voting rolls of our states. If not for the courts and the state of mind of the attorney generals and governors in those states, he likely would have had access to that. He's trying to vandalize trust as it relates to vote by mail, and so many other categories. With the SAVE Act is trying to even make it more difficult to register, which is not just about voter ID, that act, it's about registration and deciding who and who cannot vote. All of these are consistent with the phone call, the origin story here, that he made to Greg Abbott, saying he's entitled to 5 seats in an effort to rig the election before one vote is cast before November. And we're seeing that played out all across this country now after the Supreme Court decision on the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, and none more galling and outrageous than what Governor Landry did and is doing in Louisiana, where he suspended an election that was already underway, where tens of thousands of voters had already voted. Suspended the election by declaring an emergency for the intended purpose of eliminating black representation in his state. Jim Crow 2.0. These guys are not screwing around. They're ruthless. So it's in that spirit that I'm signing this. Sober about what we're up against. Sober about the fact that acolytes for the Trump administration are actively encouraging ICE to go out, just as ICE did on Election Day last November. The BORTAC teams, Border Patrol and ICE, the morning of the election last November, big press conference near Dodger Stadium to intimidate free expression and vote. It was exactly what Steve Bannon encouraged and said you'll see more of. It's exactly what the new Homeland Security Secretary suggested he won't rule out. And that's why we have to step up and we have to draw the line. We have to clarify the rules of engagement. That's why this legislation, long-windedly, is important. There are fines associated with this, criminal fines, and jail time, 3 years. So, that's a warning to the folks out there that think they can do the bidding of the Trump administration. And so eyes wide open. Trump himself just last week said yet again that he won the election in California. Can't even make that one up. I'm not talking about January 6th, the fact he pardoned all those folks that were beating up cops and absolved them, providing them $1.776 billion. So not only you get a pardon, you get rewarded. Private army with ICE, private army of protesters, stand up, stand back, as needed. That's why this is needed, and I'm very grateful for the leadership of all of you, and honored to sign this important legislation, which now officially goes into effect right when you submit to this to the Secretary of State, actually. So thank you guys. Thank you guys for this legislation. Thank you.
Governor, from a practical matter, you signed the bill. Election day is Tuesday. What happens between now and then? My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it gives the authority of the Attorney General and the Secretary of State to give some guidance to election workers. Will that happen before Election Day, and what is that guidance going to be?
Well, we've given a number, and thank you for just opening the door a little bit, and forgive me, just an adjacent point, because we've been providing just on the natural guidance to our registrars as it relates to timely ballot counting. You know the new rules that went into effect to get these things counted within 13 days, not 30 days. So there's been a lot of outreach, but this formalizes that outreach through the Department of Justice and allows them to move forward. This has all been anticipated, this moment, and certainly been part of the conversation. We could talk a little bit more about what the actions you expect to see, particularly from your vantage point, having served on the ground in terms of what your expectations are next Tuesday.
Yeah, no, election officials are ready. They are well trained and they work very closely with their local law enforcement and the Secretary of State's office and the Attorney General's office to ensure a fair, transparent, accessible, and secure election for everyone.
Governor, you've called on counties to speed up the count, to make sure that results are available quickly, to nip any misinformation in the bud. That takes resources, and I know that advocates have asked for about, I think it's $55 million. I know that Assemblymember Pellerin has asked for money to educate voters on getting ballots in early. Is that money going to show up in the budget?
Yeah, that's exactly what I opened up with as it relates to the conversation that we seeded in the May revise. There was actual language in the budget about those negotiations, which are ongoing. We're in the middle of the budget negotiations, as you know, middle of a lot of negotiations, including a lot of the ballots that are likely to otherwise end up on the November. A lot of negotiations, but that is a foundational negotiation that continues, and it's very, very positive, and we're going to land on a number very, very shortly.
Governor, the Trump administration is talking more and more about potentially pulling Customs and Border Patrol from airports in sanctuary cities. LAX, SFO, potentially SMF would be impacted. Apparently, this morning, the DHS secretary said that this is something they're looking at doing. No formal proposal yet, but just your if this has been a conversation.
Look, I mean, there's no rules anymore with the Trump administration, and and we have to be prepared for everything. And again, we talk about California. The future happens here first. It tends to, as it relates to Trump trying to exercise this sort of unitary theory of government, and had not been for the courts and the court of public opinion, he would have gone a lot farther than he has. And so we'll continue to anticipate that he's going to test the boundaries of that kind of authority. He's got a lot of authority as President of the United States as it relates to those federal resources. And we're mindful that even under sanctuary policy of those rules and regulations that are uniquely federal in the context of not getting in the way of federal operations with federal funds based on federal rules and federal regulations. At the same time, we draw the line and have drawn up plenty of documents to litigate on a lot of these issues. So we'll see what ultimately transpires. But I listened a little bit at the cabinet meeting today, and they're sort of ginning up the anxiety. They're going to gin up more fear about ICE this summer. You heard even from the Secretary of War talking about using the National Guard again this summer. So that immediately initiated, unsurprisingly, another conversation with our team, our legal team, looking at previous legal, the adjudication from the federal courts and looking at our legal strategies to prepare. And so that's the mindset, one of vigilance.
Governor, on the topic of ICE, on the Assembly floor today, there's a package of immigration-related bills that are being discussed. Assemblymember, you were just there. There's a whole lot to specify each of them for you, but I'm curious, are you on board with the package? Are those bills you would support?
1,000 bills, and so I always cautious at this stage of the process. But directionally, obviously, we've done a lot in this space. Some we've been very successful, nation-leading efforts. Some the courts put a pause on, particularly around masking, where California is the first. So directionally, I certainly have been very engaged with the legislature for many, many years, and very grateful to legislative leadership in this space. And I think many other states look to California's leadership on these bills, and so I'm also mindful of that, directionally speaking.
As the election approaches, in your mind, what's more dangerous, some of these tangible threats that you're preparing for, or the type of disinformation leading to questions about the integrity of our election process itself?
Well, it's the whole thing. As I say about Trump all the time, he's an invasive species. We've never been up against something like this, and he's just not. He's just winding up. I mean, he doesn't believe in fair and free elections. He believes in competitive authoritarianism. He wants an outcome along the lines of Putin, 87.3% to 4.3%. That's a fair and free election from Trump's perspective. And he's become so delusional that I think he's almost starting to believe in his own BS about winning all these elections, and he won in California, and he won, in 2020. It's madness. It's madness. It's madness. And everyone around him knows it. I think, the question is who's, where the hell is his cabinet? They're complicit. I mean, this is a guy that I don't have to remind you guys of the obvious. I mean, he went into Fulton County with the FBI. He was celebrating the old DNI. She's now been fired, quit, Tulsi Gabbard, but she was down there in Fulton County. I mean, this is the backdrop. This is reality. This happened. Tried to light democracy on fire. Tried to wreck this country after January 6th. Just pardoned all the participants of that and just gave them $1.8 billion slush fund. That actually happened. He has seized the ballot and he's trying to take over what's going on in Fulton County, one of the most critical swing districts in the United States of America. He sent the FBI. He didn't have to get a guy who was a former member of the Oath Keepers in Riverside to do it for him. He sent the FBI and the DNI down there for that. This is happening. It's happening. Every day he's attacking truth and trust. So yeah, I'm concerned about all of it. What's happening with AI? It's happening in all these elections. We've passed bills in this around deep fakes. You know, it's the panoply of everything. He's desperate. His back's against the wall. And when you're desperate, your back's against the wall, you're prone to do anything. And so he is just winding up.
Governor, sorry, on following up on ballot initiatives real quick, are you currently in conversations with UHW and those
I will say this directly and tonally. We are in conversations with many folks, and I'll just leave it at that. These are we're in conversations with many folks on many, I'll repeat, we're in conversations with many folks on many different topics related to ballots that have qualified. We're also engaged with the legislature, many leaders in the legislature, the leadership in the legislature, many individual leaders that are interested in these negotiations. That's the case almost in every election, and certainly the case here where there's an abundance of initiatives on the ballot. And I'll just leave it at that. Just interestingly got an update on where we are in those negotiations. So I can assure you they're not only being conducted, but robustly, and we're just beginning.
Governor, you touched a little bit on the threats from federal leaders on our elections. Do you think those threats are credible? Have you been in touch with them? Should voters expect to see ICE agents moving forward?
I expect the worst with Trump because he's done the worst. He's crossed every single line. Again, he federalized the National Guard, sent 700 active duty Marines to L.A., 5,000 troops in the streets of Los Angeles, sent out as masked men to intimidate people. The BORTAC teams, again, these are the guys cosplaying with the Apache helicopters, the whole thing. He said on the day of the election it was rigged. And he sent the Department of Justice, his DOJ, to prove that it was rigged, and then tried to go to the Supreme Court to overturn a fair and free election. That happened. It happened. It's happening. You had a guy who's desperate for attention and wants me to use his name. Today I won't. That took 650,000. That happened. Took the California Supreme Court to stop it on April 18th. That happened. What has happened? It's happening in Fulton County. I mean, it's extraordinary. And so, you know, this is we're pretty measured here in California, but we're resolved. We're drawing the line. We're holding the line. We're winning, and we are trying to inspire other states to do similar efforts.
It's time for one more. Slush fund that you mentioned. Are you looking to take any action on it? Is there anything you can do about that?
Well, I've been thinking a lot. I'm not in Congress. I was out there in Washington, D.C., trying to make a case anew. And some good meetings with EPA. Lee Zeldin's, I don't want to get him fired. But, you know, his team's working hard to see what we can do to help the victims of last year's fires in Los Angeles. And, you know, so I was up there around the time when legislative leaders were all, you know, discussing what the options were. And so I've been thinking a lot about it in my flight back. And one thing that I think we're going to try to do with your support is tax 100%. Anyone from California that receives any of those funds, we want to tax 100% of those proceeds. And that's an action the state of California can take. It's an action we look forward to taking.
Governor, still no endorsement in the governor's race, is that correct? 60
A lot of endorsements out there, so no, there are many of them. You mean mine? That's
Yours
different. Yeah, no.
specifically, nothing.
I'm the Jerry Brown of this cycle.
On this, and maybe this might be for our legislators, but the sheriff of Riverside County, I'm just going to quote him here. He has said that he launched this investigation because there's a discrepancy in the number of votes counted versus processed. And so how would you explain why that showed up? Because he's claiming that elections officials there did not give him an answer.
Well,
So-
I mean, I could.
Sure.
Well, I just want to say, first of all, that ballots can be subject to inspection. they have to remain in the custody of the elections official. So if he has questions about how the ballots were counted or wants them recounted, that can be done as long as the ballots remain in the custody of the elections official and that work is done by them. And that happens every now and then.
So I actually read the warrant. If you read the warrant, you saw that there was actually no crime alleged, which makes it deficient on its face. And it also has no ostensible, reliable information. So when you say that there was inaccurate, or excuse me, that the vote counts were different between those ballots that were cast and those that were issued and those kinds of things, it's just not, the whole thing was not credible. It was a farce.
And just to further add on, because of the chain of custody that was broken, those ballots are now entirely compromised.
Right.
And along with that, this is unlike any other case where we've ever seen, because it's usually the district attorney's office that's handling these investigations. It's not a Riverside County or a county sheriff.
So would this prevent like a judge in the future from issuing this kind of warrant?
No, it's a court order that's separate and above. That's not addressed specifically in this, but chain of custody issues are. And obviously, we don't have to go back through the clarification process that the Supreme Court ultimately advanced in this respect. So it addresses those issues. That's why I suggest it doesn't resolve all of those outstanding issues, but certainly directionally addresses some of them. And every single thing that Donald Trump is saying only suggests that he will do more, not less, to intimidate and to impact the outcome of this election. He's just winding up. So I absolutely expect the worst again, because we've been on the receiving end of it over and over and over again.
Sorry, but you said that ICE was at the polls last November. I don't recall.
ICE, the board TAC teams were sent out the morning of the election at Dodger Stadium. They did a big show of force. These are the Border Patrol tactical units. And it was a show of force designed to intimidate free expression and free speech. The same morning that on Truth Social, Trump said the election was rigged and had Department of Justice investigators out there, quote unquote, proving it.
Which is why it's so important for people to vote.
Yeah. So.
I had a question about a different kind of threat regarding the Garden Grove chemical incident. Do you or other state leaders have concerns about the fact that there's residents living near those areas? And if so, what changes are needed in the investigation?
Well, we were just talking, how about those Orange County firefighters? Talk about rock stars. Talk about bravery. You were just describing some of the images of these guys not knowing what was going to come as they're ripping off layers to address some of the issues of trying to determine what was or was not happening inside that tank in question. So I just, hats off to all the first responders, the coordinated response to that, to the residents, 50,000 plus that were displaced and over Memorial Day weekend, so it's the right question. Obviously, all of us are now reviewing and have been in real time the safety records, not only of this site, but looking more broadly at other chemicals and other sites, particularly highlighted by what happened tragically in Washington State as well. As it relates to industrial facilities in around urban centers, that's a longer, that's a more challenging issue of geography. But it only reinforces, in my mind, what we can control, and that is the safety, and make sure that the state EPA and OSHA and others are working collaboratively with our federal partners. I will say I'm concerned, as we all should be, of some of the federal cutbacks to safety investments that have been made over the last year federally and are proposed in the president's new budget. And I hope this tempers that likelihood that they'll move forward with those cuts. I think they should be more robust in terms of those investigations, not less.
But do you believe that more regulation of chemical plants like these is necessary?
That's what I'm suggesting as it relates to the rules and regulations all being reviewed, safety records being reviewed as well.
But there will be legislation.
You're already working on it.
And he's already tightening it further.
Can we get a group shot real quick? Just quick photo is fine, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
We're gonna get a bill that also forbids law enforcement putting ice from coming in polling places.
I saw that. That's